Greetings, everyone, and welcome to tonight's program, Brooklyn Resists Act 2, Core and the Civil Rights Movement. This is the second of three programs that look at the long history of the movement for racial justice in Brooklyn. My name is Heather Mallon, and I'm the director of the Center for Brooklyn History at Brooklyn Public Library. We are honored to be partnering in this three-part series with New York University's Brooklyn-based 370J project, the Office of Global Inclusion, Diversity, and Strategic Innovation, the Center for Black Visual Culture, and the Institute for Public Knowledge. Tonight's program continues the public-facing component of a multifaceted public history initiative that deeply explores how the protest movement of the present ties to generations of activists and leaders who came before. This project, Brooklyn Resists, encompasses a collecting initiative documenting last summer's protests and those that are still ongoing. It will include an exhibition made up of projections on the exterior of our building at 128 Pierpont, which will open on Juneteenth. And it will bring you many more public programs and much, much more. Before the program begins tonight, I want to share two important notes. One is that tonight's program can be experienced with closed captions. That function is available at the bottom of your screen. I also want to invite all of you to share questions tonight. Simply type them into the Q&A box, also at the bottom of your screen. And now it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Lisa M. Coleman, NYU's inaugural Senior Vice President for Global Inclusion and Strategic Innovation and Chief Diversity Officer. Reporting to the President, Dr. Coleman works with the Office of the Provost, Deans, other senior leaders, and constituents to advance, promote, and build capacity for strategic global inclusion, diversity, equity, belonging, and innovation initiatives across NYU globally. Prior to NYU, Dr. Coleman served as the first special assistant to the president of Harvard University and chief diversity officer. Dr. Coleman, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Heather. It's such a pleasure to be here this evening. Welcome, everyone. Before we move forward in tonight's program, I would like to honor the indigenous peoples whose lands we now occupy. We acknowledge that we are gathered here in this virtual space, but many of our institutions and homes are located on the unceded lands of indigenous peoples. We acknowledge that the United States was founded upon the exclusions and erasures of many indigenous peoples, as well as the discounted labor of many indigenous and other marginalized communities. We continue in our efforts to both recognize and dismantle these systemic exclusions and systems of oppression. I also would like to say I hope everyone is taking very good care. People keep saying that this is the new normal. It is not. I have been saying that it is the new unusual. Stress, health, home caring for others, disparate impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, and so on. Thank you to those who place themselves at risk every day, whose labor is often unseen and unrecognized, those who make our daily work and lives possible. Healthcare professionals, facilities and systems maintenance teams, and delivery teams, just to name a few. A lot has happened this year, and we remain in solidarity to repudiate the ongoing crises of anti-Black violence, anti-Asian violence, and we are in the midst of ongoing and social health crises and transformation. The ongoing murders and loss of life among BIPOC children and adults, compounded by the continued disproportionate impacts among marginalized communities, make our work and our responsibility to be aware of the historical trajectories of systemic and systematic oppression and the ongoing impact on all types of marginalized communities, as well as to rethink and reimagine equity and liberation movements, which is imperative. Programs like tonight are crucial to strengthening our historical understanding and informing our action steps on how to dismantle intersectional inequities. We are again in the Office of Global Inclusion, happy to partner and delighted to partner on these programs. And I just want to especially thank Heather Mallon, Marsha Eli, Natiba Guy Clement, and Michelle Montalbano of the Center for Brooklyn History, Ellen Toscano at the NYU Brooklyn-based 370J Project, Deb Willis of the Center for Black Visual Culture, and Jessica Kofi of the Institute for Public Knowledge. And of course, our wonderful panelists who have joined us this evening. And from my office, thank you, Autumn Rain, and thank you for partnering with us on this program and of course the previous programs and upcoming programs. Now it is my absolute pleasure and honor to introduce our moderator, Jami Floyd. Jami Floyd is well known as the former local host of All Things Considered and legal editor in the WNYC Newsroom. She also now leads WNYC's Race and Justice Unit that covers the news through the prism of race, class, and social justice. Floyd has a degree from Berkeley Law School and has taught at the Stanford Law School before embarking on her journalism career that now spans over 2 decades and has included stints at ABC News, CBS News, and Court TV. She has appeared as a legal and political analyst on many news outlets, including CNN, Fox News, NBC, MSNBC, and PBS. Thank you for being with us. And now I turn it over to you, Jami. Jami, you're still muted.
Thank you very, very much. Third time's a charm. Thank you very, very much for that introduction, Dr. Coleman. It's always so good to be with you. This is our second of 3 conversations we will have together, and I hope actually very much that there will be many more thereafter. And I want us to continue to be mindful that we sit together only a week after the verdict in the Chauvin case. Derek Chauvin found guilty of the murder of George Floyd. And that was not the end of a story. That is only the beginning of the work of restorative justice and reform that we, I hope, are all embarking upon together. And with that, I will bring in partners in that work, our guests tonight. Brian J. Purnell, the Jeffrey Canada Associate Professor of Africana Studies and History at Bowdoin College. He is the author of the award-winning Fighting Jim Crow in the County of Kings, the Congress of Racial Equality in Brooklyn, our topic tonight, and the co-editor with Jeanne Theoharis of the very well-known The Strange Careers of the Jim Crow North, Segregation and Struggle Outside of the South. And Dr. Purnell's research, writing, and teaching concentrates on African-American history, urban history, and civil rights, and Black Power history as well. And I want to mention, Brian, that you were born and raised in Brooklyn. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. We're also joined by Jeanne Theoharis, the Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Brooklyn College of City University of New York. She is the author and co-author of 9 books and many, many articles on the civil rights and Black Power movements, the politics of race and education and social welfare and civil rights in post 9/11 America. And I want to mention my personal favorite, I think, the biography, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, which won so many awards, including one from the NAACP Association of Black Women Historians. And her most recent book, maybe this one's my favorite, A More Beautiful and Terrible History, The Uses and Misuses of Civil Rights History. Thank you, Jeanne Theoharis. It's so good to see you again and be with you this evening. And our next guest, Jumaane Williams. I always just like saying his name. The public advocate of the city of New York. Previously, he served on the New York City Council representing the 45th District, a first-generation Brooklynite of Grenadian heritage. He graduated from the public school system, overcoming the difficulties of Tourette's and ADHD to earn a master's degree from Brooklyn College. On the City Council, he championed the Community Safety Act, which addressed the abuses of stop, question, and frisk in communities of color and created the NYPD's Office of Inspector General to investigate unlawful and unethical behavior. Mr. Public Advocate, welcome to you. And I'm so pleased to have all of you here tonight. We're going to have what I hope will be a conversation more than my moderated questions. And then we're going to have questions from the audience as well in about, I would say, 20, 25 minutes. But let's begin, I guess, with our native Brooklynite, Brian, or I guess I just have to call you Dr. Purnell. I'm very old fashioned. And let's start by talking about our primary subject here tonight, of which you've written, the seminal work, the Congress of Racial Equality. And I've got to give my father a shout out. He worked on the Congress of Racial Equality in Chicago. But tell us about the Congress of Racial Equality in Brooklyn. And I guess I'll ask you to start by just helping us to focus in on what those words actually meant to the founders. Congress of Racial Equality. What were their goals and aspirations?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great way to start. And, thank you to Jami Floyd for being here, for, moderating and giving all your energy and enthusiasm to this great conversation. And so the Congress of Racial Equality, in short, it had three main kind of aspects to its characteristics, its purpose. One, it was devoted to nonviolence, right? I think that's important. That's probably one of the most important. It's a little complicated to understand what it means, but nonviolence was the main tactic that the Congress of Racial Equality used. They were not all members of the Congress of Racial Equality were like morally or spiritually devoted to Gandhian, Martin Luther King type nonviolence, but nonviolence was the national organization's primary tactic for fighting against racism. The second was it was interracial. CORE, you mentioned Chicago. It starts in Chicago in the 1940s. I'm not going to lecture, not going to get into all those details, but it is consistently committed to embodying an interracial, Black and white primarily, membership to literally kind of be the change that they wanted to see in America. So that's the second important component to CORE. And then the last one is, to use our language, this might not be the language they would have used, but CORE is fiercely committed to dismantling racism in every and all manifestations that its local chapters encountered. And this is what makes the Brooklyn chapter and a lot of other CORE chapters so interesting, because CORE existed throughout the country, in the North, in the South, in the East, in the West. Its local chapters guided how the organization would use nonviolence and interracialism to dismantle, to attack racism with direct action protest. That's the way that it all ties together. This was a group committed to protest, to changing through activism, disruption, and protest nonviolently. So we'll spend a lot of time talking about what made the Brooklyn chapter special, but those are the main characteristics of what the Congress of Racial Equality was about.
I am going to ask you what made the Brooklyn chapter so special that you wrote a whole book about it. But before we get there, talk a bit about direct action protests. We're seeing a lot of protest, right? We've had in just about a year, May 25th is when George Floyd was murdered. And we're coming up on that anniversary, that tragic, revelatory for some, not for all of us, anniversary. And then millions of people worldwide protesting, but maybe not direct action protests. So what is that? What is direct? I don't, can we learn from it?
Yeah, I don't want to make too much of a distinction without a difference type explanation, but there is something specific about what CORE at least tried to do with direct action protest. And that is this, right? They were followers of Mahatma Gandhi, the Indian nationalist, anti-imperialist leader who used nonviolent direct action civil disobedience to bring anti-colonialism to India in the 1940s. And CORE, in its original manifestation, wanted to apply those types of tactics to racism in America. So here's what direct action protest meant. First, they would identify a problem, whatever the problem was. In Brooklyn, it was racially segregated schools. It was racially segregated housing. It was employment discrimination in multiple sectors of life. It was inequalities in municipal services, primarily trash, but also police. And so they would identify a problem, they would study the problem, meaning they would get the facts, they would publish or try to disseminate information about the facts of the problem. Then they would move towards negotiation, right? They would try to reach out to power brokers, influence makers, and say, listen, here's the facts of the situation. Let's change these facts to be more equitable, to be more just. Inevitably, when they would meet resistance, intransigence, outright rejection, they would then move towards, as they would see it as a final step, they would move towards protest. And the reason for what direct action protest means is that the protest itself, after these steps, would embody the type of injustice that they were looking to overturn. So it was, the protest itself was a way to make visible the problem of racism and discrimination. And I'll just conclude by saying this is particularly important in a place like Brooklyn and in the North, because so much of people's conceptions of racism and discrimination is that racism is invisible. You can't see it. It's covert, it's insidious. These are all kind of the code words that people would use to pretend that something that is pervasive and systemic and widespread is somehow an accident, right? My friend, my colleague, my teacher, Jeanne Theoharis, has this great line where she says, racism outside of the South hid in plain sight. So if you are an activist trying to uncover and change discriminatory practices, you have to use direct action protests to make what everybody thinks of as invisible, to make it visible. So that was the role that protests played, not only in attempting to change situations, but also in bringing to light and spreading information about the pervasiveness of these problems.
Well, I take the cue. I will turn to Professor Theoharis and ask the question then. I do want to come back to the theme of protest specifically in just a moment, and I'm going to ask Jumaane Williams a couple of questions about that, because he's been in amongst on the ground in the protests. But Professor Theoharis, let me ask you about CORE specifically, because, you know, there were all these different organizations, you know, with similar nonviolent protests approach, SNCC, SCLC, others that were less committed to nonviolence, as we know. And you've written about all of them, I think. What distinguished CORE, not just in Brooklyn, but generally? What set it apart, so much so that you were interested in writing about it?
So again, I just wanted to say thank you, Jami, for being here, and this is an honor to be together. I should say this is the first panel Jumaane and I have been on. Jumaane was a student of mine when I first got to Brooklyn College, so it's an honor to be here with Jumaane, and then with Brian. Brian and I have worked together for many, many years. So this is sort of like all in the family, really. So I think if we're going to talk about CORE, and I want to pick up something that Brian was just talking about, because I think part of what sort of my own work and where Brian and my work come together is around thinking about the Black freedom struggle outside the South. And I think CORE helps us see that, in part because, like Brian was saying, CORE, there are all these different chapters of CORE, but CORE, unlike, there were Friends of SNCC chapters all around the country, but one of the distinctive things about CORE in this period is that it is a locally driven movement, right? Like in all these different, where all these different chapters are. And so part of what the work that CORE is doing is unveiling kind of racial injustice, not just in the South, because I think most of us, if we know CORE, we think the Freedom Rides. And obviously what we're doing tonight is pivoting away from a kind of Southern focused civil rights movement and a kind of Southern focused CORE to the ways that CORE was taking on the systematic nature of racism, not just in the South, but in the Northeast, in the Midwest, on the West Coast. And I think they help us see what we might, I think there's a tendency to see this heroic civil rights movement in the South, and that's the way we tend to learn about the civil rights movement, and then it moves north after Watts, right? And obviously I've spent my whole career, Brian spent his whole career basically trying to challenge that and to say, at the very same time that this movement in the South is happening that we know a lot more about, there are movements happening all across the country. And looking at Brooklyn CORE, I think helps us, again, here in Brooklyn, to see that at the same time that SNCC is building sort of movements in Mississippi and in Georgia, in Alabama, right? That CORE is building these kind of direct action struggles all across the country. And so we see the tactics being used in the Southern civil rights movement being used right here in New York. So we see disruptive protest, right? So we see, one of my favorite things that CORE does, right? To dramatize the fact that people are getting different kinds of garbage pickup, right? And so some neighborhoods are getting 5 days a week and some neighborhoods are getting 2. And many of those neighborhoods that are getting less are neighborhoods that have grown increasingly overcrowded because of kind of housing segregation. And so part of the genius of CORE and of Brooklyn CORE in specific is, like Brian was saying, making visible the systems of inequality in a place like New York City that constantly touted itself as liberal and open and not racist. And so part of what Brooklyn CORE is showing is, in fact, the systemic nature of racism in a place like New York that sees itself as above that. So let me stop there.
Well, you don't ever have to stop. I could listen to you all evening. I will share with the audience that it was very endearing when public advocate Jumaane Williams came into our virtual green room and greeted his professor, Theoharis, so warmly. The only sad part is that it is virtual and we weren't in a real green room, so we could hug it out. I could watch you hug it out. That would have been nice. But let me turn to you, Jumaane Williams, because obviously your work, your life, you've taken what you've learned in Professor Theoharis's classroom and you're living the work, right? And you've been, I've reported on or covered, I should say, as a host, the time you've spent with the protests, protesters, Mott Haven most notably in my mind, because that's where it has been so troubling. We could talk in detail with folks if they have questions in the audience about what happened there. But I would love to hear you reflect on what Brian and Jeanne have said about the nature of protests now versus, or maybe not versus, as compared to or in the tradition of direct action protests as we understand Brooklyn CORE to have employed it, or CORE generally. What are your thoughts as an advocate, as public advocate, or as a citizen about how protests can be employed in the modern era.
Well, peace and blessings, love and light to everybody. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be on this panel. It's intimidating. There's so much knowledge on this. I just feel like I'm in class again, listening to Dr. Purnell and Professor Theoharis, and I'm learning. I hope everybody's learning as well. But this is just a great discussion. What's really dope to me is the focus on New York and the North, because from slavery to civil rights, we usually only discuss the South. And it's important, the history is particularly important because it really leads us to the impact of today. And sometimes people believe we just woke up and got here when we didn't. One of my proud moments was putting in a piece of legislation that led to a marker near Wall Street to identify the open air slave market that was actually on Wall Street. And that's important because, as you mentioned, the issues in New York are pretty bad and often even more segregated in some places in the South. And so we got here because of something, and it was because of the issues that most people usually give to the South. And I consider myself an activist, elected official. I was trying my best to kick up trouble at Brooklyn College as well. And so it was a good training ground to be able to go to Professor Theoharis' class and then try to apply as much as I could to stir up as much dust as I could at the Brooklyn College campus. I'm warmly received now. As, you know, I get to go back and people pretend like some of that trouble didn't happen, but it's good. It's cool. But you know, it very much is a continuation. And in my mind, I think most folks' mind who understand history and how change happens, there was never a question that this was a connection and a continuation of the civil rights movements that have happened in the past. I think that, you know, there are differences just in times. I think in the past there were, you know, the organization of it was a little different. The focus was a little different. There were singular leaders in certain ways that aren't there today in the same way. But I think the tactics are very similar. Sometimes they don't have the specific goal that was assigned to a specific protest, but the continuation and the impact is still the same. And the need to disrupt the status quo has always been continual. And that's what's always been the most shocking to me, that somehow people believe that the changes that are being asked would happen simply by people saying, please, can you please do this? That has never happened. I don't even think it happens anywhere in the world. It certainly hasn't happened here in America. And so the need to disrupt, even when you spoke of nonviolence, which is what I'm a very big Kingian nonviolent person, and I'm always careful to say, I can't say that there should be peaceful protests, because sometimes the disruption of the peace is what causes things to happen. But I do support nonviolent protests. And that when I'm on the streets, I'm doing my best to see if we can have constructive dialogue in that manner to try to understand what the protesters want and make sure their voices are heard and as constructive as possible.
I want to note that the family of Jerry and Elaine Wiebold are in the audience, again, virtual. Someday soon, we will be together again. But I suppose we should be grateful that we have this, right? At least we've had the virtual. This would have been a lot harder without the virtual, but I want to make that recognition. I have a note here in the chat that we have the daughter Melanie and granddaughter Nia Roby and Lawson, grandson of Jerry and Elaine, and son of Dr. Douglas Wiebold. And I want to then turn, with all of that in mind, back to you, Brian, because in your book, this is a significant chapter, right?
Yeah, so and to be brief, so we can get to as many questions and good conversation as possible. And please, you know, Jeanne and Jumaane, chime in. Let's make this a collective endeavor, right? I mean, so the Wiebold family were, Jerome and Elaine were members of Brooklyn Core in the 1960s. And to make a very great story, a dramatic story, and an important story far too short, they kind of were on the sidelines. Like Elaine even said, I thought I would just kind of get involved and, help out, but I wasn't really looking to be at the center of anything. They were busy. Jerome Beebold had he worked for GHI, government health insurance. Elaine was raising, at the time, 3 children. They wanted to participate in the struggle, and they wanted to fight against racism. They were an interracial couple. Elaine was Black, Jerome was white. They had a history of activism. I'm not saying they woke up one day and they just said, hey, let me do this, right? Like, they had a history of being concerned about social justice, but again, they weren't going to be on the ramparts, so to speak, until, and this is what's fascinating about activism, sometimes history taps you on your shoulder. They had an unforeseen tragedy, terrible thing. Thank God nobody was hurt, but their apartment caught fire. They had to change schools. So basically, these were, these were educated parents. These were parents involved in their children's lives. They were working parents. They were just like New York parents, right? Their kids were doing great in school when they went to the original school, which was in the Crown Heights section of Brooklyn at the time, but they had to move to, this was 1962, they had to move to the then Park Slope section. Don't think of Park Slope now. Think of Park Slope then, when Park Slope in 1962 was a poor and working class kind of, mixed race community. And the school that they had to attend when they went to Park Slope, it didn't have the same type of resources. And that's what I want to emphasize. It was a racially segregated school, even though Park Slope itself was, I won't say integrated, because even integrated neighborhoods in New York have pockets of segregation. But the school, the way that the school was zoned, made it about 70% Black and Puerto Rican. But structurally, it did not have the types of accelerated classes that they had in the other school. It didn't have the same number of books. It didn't have the same types of classes. Elaine became most aware of this when the oldest son, Douglas, and that's with 2 S's because they named him after Frederick. When Douglas came home and he threw his test down on the kitchen table and it was 100, but he was all upset. And his mother said, well, why are you upset? You did so well. And he said, but mommy, look at the work. And she saw this was a 5th grader who had come from a school where he was doing advanced reports on the front page of the New York Times, current events, taking trips to the Museum of Natural History, all that enrichment stuff, right, in a public school. And now he's taking classes where he has to spell cat, bat, ball, hall, and things like that. And he literally, Douglas, who became a physician, he literally would become withdrawn in the classes. He started murmuring to himself in class because, as he said, he was so bored. But the teacher saw him sitting there talking to himself. She wanted to label him special ed. She wanted to get him sent to a 600 school. And if you're of a certain age, you know what that is in New York City. So that's when Elaine Beebold primarily kind of threw her hands down and said, enough is enough. Like, I need help. And so where did she go? She went to the Brooklyn chapter of CORE. And from there ensued this incredible campaign where one family with 3 children tried to use their individual issue to draw attention to what they knew was a systemic citywide problem. And Brooklyn CORE, with allies in other organizations, used the Beebold family's very real situation, because it wasn't just about the Beebolds. The Beebolds were emblematic of hundreds of thousands of Black and Puerto Rican and poor New York kids who were stuck in a system that proved itself incapable of meeting the diverse needs of a just public education system. So the Beebold family became this one case that was going to be exemplary and representative of the city. And that's what the chapter is about. And it's fascinating and sad. I'll be honest, let me just highlight this. So one of the things they do, one of the tactics in the direct action protest is to stage a sit-in. the Beeble family with Brooklyn Core, they take their kids out of the racially segregated school. They park them in an all-white school that had an abundance of open seats in the Bath Beach section of Brooklyn. No requests, no permission. They decide to move the kids themselves into a new district. So they sit them in at the school. Now, Douglas, who's in the 5th grade, he has a pretty good experience. The kids accept him. The teacher includes him. Again, he goes from accelerated class to having to move into a segregated school. Then they think he's special ed. Now he's back in a school where they're doing work and when the teachers care about the kids. So his teacher gave him attention, included him in the class. But Carrington, or Carr as he's known, who was Douglas's younger brother in the 4th grade, they excluded him, they isolated him. They didn't recognize him, they didn't talk to him, they didn't include him. And I think, and Melanie is in the audience, I heard from Douglas when I did my research that Melanie, who was in the 1st grade at the time, had a similar experience to Carrington, to Carr. And so Carrington had a really different experience with this sit-in. It stressed him out, it upset him. He felt a lot of pressure, he didn't feel welcomed. And for him, this protest and this experience of integrating this all-white class was hostile. And so there's a lot of other things that happen in the campaign: death threats, calls to attack the children, intransigence from the Board of Education, threats to put the family in jail, the parents in jail, and the way that the campaign ends, which we could get into if there's time. So I raise this as an example. It's a chapter in the book. It's one of the many things that Brooklyn Core did. It's still public advocate, people's advocate Williams could speak about this. You know, this was 1962. This problem hasn't ended, right? This problem hasn't gone away in New York. There's still families like the Beebles. There's probably more, right? So we can learn from this history, both how difficult of a problem this was, and the types of things that a committed, inventive, creative community of activists did to try to change it, and the challenges that the people who are on the front lines of trying to bring this change, the challenges that they faced.
I wanted to, if I may, because you started a point that I wanted to make, and you know, most of the examples that we're going to talk about here, the topics are still germane. So whether we're going to talk about schooling, whether we're going to talk about jobs, you can even talk about trash, and the communities that are dealing with these issues, still the same communities, and they're still the same issues, and they have been for quite some time. And what I've realized, and I keep saying this all the time, is because, you know, many people are talking about reforms and the system being broken. I've come to understand the system is not actually broken. The system is working how the system was designed to operate. What I try to do is talk about we just need a whole new system, and that's where the struggle comes in. Like if your house had a small crack in the wall, you might plaster it up and go about your business. But if the foundation of the house was flawed, that's a very difficult job. And what we've seen that makes it difficult is, I think people, generally speaking, want to talk about equity and addressing equity and equality, but when it comes to their actual school or their actual block or their it gets a little finicky, it gets a little funky. And I do think there's you know, what makes it difficult, there is a system of privilege that exists. Nobody on this call listening is actually responsible for it, but we're all responsible for the system we bring the next generation. But the problem is, there are some folks who believe that people who are struggling and people in Black and brown communities, you know, for racist, supremacist reasons, should be there. But there's another group of folks that sometimes could be just as nefarious, is that they want to ignore the cost of the privilege that exists. And so they can, or maybe will even acknowledge certain privileges, but sometimes it's hard to acknowledge the cost of that privilege is these oppressive policies that exist. And if you do away with those oppressive policies, lives are going to change in a specific way. I think that's the battle we've always had, because I think people want a particular system in this country without acknowledging the cost of that system, or they're in a category where they think because of supremacist views that that's the way it's supposed to be.
It's one thing to talk about change. It's another thing to actually give something up to, to allow for the change. So, there's the group actively fighting the change, the avowed supremacists, but then there are the allies who are all about allyship until they realize, oh, you mean I actually have to give up a slot in that school, or pay a little more tax, or let you move into my neighborhood, or let some homeless folks stay in this hotel right down the street from me? What? I didn't realize that's what you were talking about. Maybe I'm not as progressive as I thought.
Uh-oh, you're gonna get some people in trouble here.
Oh, I'm getting myself in trouble. So I think I'll throw a question to Jeanne Theoharis and bring it back to Brooklyn, because that's what we're about here tonight, and ask you along the lines of the question I asked earlier, which was what made CORE different from some of the other organizations, and ask you what was Brooklyn CORE's mission and focus vis-a-vis the other chapters, I guess is the right phrase, right? What was special about Brooklyn CORE? I guess you could write a lot of different books about a lot of different CORE chapters, but you wrote this one. And so tell us a little bit about, I guess Brian wrote that book, and I'm going to come over to you, Brian, and ask you the same question, but what made this such a unique? I understand that we should be focused on the North, but the North is a big place. Why Brooklyn?
Well, I think a couple of things, right? I mean, I think one of the things that I think, obviously, the Brooklyn Public Library, what was formerly the Brooklyn Historical Society and now is the Center for Brooklyn History, I think reminds us in this program tonight and more broadly is that there is a long history of struggle in this very place, in this place that, again, constantly talks about itself as progressive, as open. And I think one of the things that we learn from that is both the kinds of movements people built, and also the barriers and forces they encountered against them. And so I wanted to actually tell a story from kind of 1964 Brooklyn CORE. So Brooklyn CORE is doing work, as Brian was saying. They're doing testing to show that landlords are renting to white people and not renting to Black people. They're doing, obviously, this work around school segregation. They're doing work around trying to highlight businesses that don't hire Black people. They're doing Operation Clean Sweep and this work around disparate sanitation. By and large, they're getting, if anything, token solutions, right? So they get a couple jobs at Evangers. They get a solution for the Beebles that is not at all a systemic solution whatsoever. And so by 1964, Brooklyn CORE, which again is committed to direct action, is very frustrated by this kind of liberal resistance. So this we're not the South, we're not racist, but you're the problem. And, and okay, we'll throw 2 jobs at you. We'll throw 1 seat at you. And so 1964 is the year of the World's Fair, right? Coming to Flushing Meadows. Right. And so Brooklyn CORE decides that they want to highlight the systemic nature of inequality, and they want to make people have to see it. And so they decide they're going to do a stall-in on the highways out to Flushing Meadows. And I'm telling this story also because I think, like Jumaane was talking about, we could see the modern resonances, right? So they propose this stall-in on the first day of the World's Fair. And as you might imagine, moderate leaders, Black and white, go nuts. They think this is a horrible idea. This is terrible. How could you do this? This is, inappropriate. This is reckless. This is violent. And they call on Dr. King. They say, Dr. King, will you come out against this? And this is one of my favorite Dr. King things lately. And I'm going to quote him verbatim. So he refuses. And he also highlights the poverty, the denial of access to public accommodation, voting, housing, education, and jobs. So one of the things is Dr. King is very aware that racism is not just a Southern problem. But then he's unwilling to come. So this is a disruptive tactic, a tactic that we see kind of come all the way into the present, right? And this is what Dr. King says. He says, We do not need allies who are more devoted to order than to justice. I hear a lot of talk these days about our direct action talk alienating former friends. I would rather feel they are bringing to the surface latent prejudices that are already there. If our direct action programs alienate our friends, they never were really our friends. And so I think we have here, right, Dr. King speaking to this kind of disruptive protest and saying this is necessary in part because here we have New York, here we have Brooklyn, that's constantly kind of denying the problem or throwing like little tiny token solutions. And we have to get to the root of the problem. And that is going to require people being uncomfortable. And I think we can see parallels to that going all the way into the present, and the same kind of, outrage, like how could you stall cars on the highway? These Black Lives Matter protesters are so violent, they're so reckless. And again, I quote from Dr. King there because I think he speaks to us today as well as he was speaking, on behalf of Brooklyn Core Stalin.
Yeah, I think, I love that quote from Dr. King. I'm just grateful when people use his quotes in context, because I think there's a lot of folks who try to go to Dr. King to prevent the type of things that Dr. King would have absolutely supported. And I don't think people understand the radical and revolutionary King. And I don't think people understand that he was actually one of, if not the most hated person right up to his death by the entire country, white and Black. And that's something that we have to remember when people lift up his name as if they were in love with him. What I found is people sometimes make these comparisons between Dr. King and Malcolm X, whom I love both of them, but they were both killed pretty violently. And so what it seems like is that it's not a matter of how the protest occurs, it's probably more what you're protesting about. That is the problem.
Yeah, I want to welcome, Melanie Roby or Robbie. I'm sorry, Melanie, if I'm getting that wrong, because I got your brother's name wrong and somebody called it out, which is good. It's Carrington, not Carrington. But Melanie's here. Melanie was one of the younger of the Beeble children, and I'm hoping that she can participate in the conversation too. It's really important that we hear from any of the people who lived through this history, like the research that Jeanne and I do, it's not possible without people like Melanie, her brothers, her parents, their friends, their comrades, their loved ones. And so, yeah, we're real grateful. And, let me just, if through you, be able to say I know your parents are deceased, but like they were so, loving to me and generous and kind, they really kind of believed in preserving the history that they lived. And I'm really grateful and thankful that they entrusted, their stories, not to me, but just kind of with me. So anyway, if I could just say thank you to them through you, and thank you to you and your brothers for what you did to try to make the city a little bit better. So this is a real treat that you're here with us.
Well, and really here, look, Brian, right there. Melanie Roby with us.
Yes.
Thank you for joining on camera.
It's my pleasure.
Do you want to say a few words about your family and their important role? Or would you like to say something else? The floor is yours.
Thank you. Actually, I wanted to respond to what Brother Purcell just said about my parents, because the work that they did not end with them. They created, in my brothers and I, a commitment to the liberation of Black people that we have passed on generation to generation. Like he mentioned, my oldest brother, Doug, is a doctor. But Doug was not as much a doctor as he is a healer. And for the majority of his professional career, he worked to take care of poor people. So his patients were Medicaid and Medicare, and he had to live with the financial limitations that required. But he was committed to serving our people in that way. Carr is like our brain trust, because he stores all of the information that we need to have access to at any given moment. And also in the work that I've done, but it's just, to me, it is amazing at how, to me, still, how important the upbringing that I got from my parents was, not just to my life, but to the lives of other people that I've been able to influence based on being raised by my parents. And everything that I learned through them, because we didn't just go to school eventually at PS 130, but we also went to school after school at a place called the Huasasa Shule, which was run by the East, which was back in the day called the Mashariki Leo, which was a very strong community-based Brooklyn organization that had a newspaper, different businesses, but cultural events. And they were very much focused on educating their children, which was my generation. And so everything that I learned as a result, as a human being and as a Black nationalist, I learned because of my parents. So their, what they gave, is going to long live, outlive even people who knew them.
That's a lovely tribute. And I have to say that the chapter in Brian's book is, you did a lovely job tonight, Brian, bringing Melanie's family to life here, but the chapter in the book, I'm inspired to ask you to write a whole book, a whole book on Melanie's family. But Jeanne Theoharis, seeing Melanie here and hearing Elaine, her mother's name, in this conversation, reminds me that you've written so much on the women of the movement. And, my mother worked with and I will say to you, Melanie, I too am from an interracial, very unusual thing back in those days. Now everybody talks about multiracial, biracial. That didn't exist back then. I was like,
and
what?
you know what?
I
don't believe it exists now, but that's a whole nother conversation.
A whole new thing. That's why Barack Obama is a Black man.
That's
there was no issue for him to check on the form. But I want to say, I want to ask Jeanne Theoharis about Melanie's mother, Elaine, and the women of CORE and of the movement at the time in Brooklyn specifically. Because we did our last session in this series of conversations about the women of Brooklyn who were in the earlier part of the movement, 100 years earlier. We were talking about the suffrage period, but this was a hard time for women in the civil rights movement in particular. But it seems to me, just from the anecdotes that I've heard, that CORE was a little more willing to involve women than some of the other civil rights organizations. Is that just my misinformed anecdotal sense from my mother and Melanie's mother? Or was it a little more open to having women involved?
Oh, sorry, I need to unmute myself. So I think one of the things that we can see from Melanie's mom is the kind of pivotal role that women and mothers are playing in the movement for school desegregation here in New York City. And in many ways, kind of what the Beebolds do. In the early 60s, we see 9 Harlem mothers do in 1958, right? In terms of the Harlem 9 taking their kids out of school, right? That this is a continuum of, and not only mothers, absolutely, but of Black parents and particularly Black mothers kind of refusing to be kind of sidelined and silenced about kind of what their children deserved. And I think we need to remember that part of how segregation is being justified in a city like New York, that prides itself on being open, is through not like segregation now and forever like George Wallace. It's by saying things like these kids are culturally deprived, or these families don't value education as much or have the right values for success. And so one of the things that families like the Beebolds and mothers like Elaine and the Harlem Nine mothers are doing is they're pushing directly against that ideology. That's one of the ways that segregation is being maintained in New York and continues to be maintained, right? So you very rarely have white families in New York or in Brooklyn, you know, kind of, again, doing the kind of segregation now and forever. They're saying, we don't like crime, we don't like, you know, we are parents and taxpayers, because that's the name of the white parent movement that grows in opposition to school desegregation activists like the Beebolds, right? And so part of what women like Elaine Beebold, and May Mallory in Harlem are doing is they are, both with their actions and the ways they're framing the struggle, is they're pressing back on that very ideology that's justifying segregation in a liberal place like New York City.
Well, I'm always happy to leave it with the women. And we are at time, but I want to say a very special thank you to our guests tonight. And we had an extra guest too. We had Melanie Roby. So what a nice treat that was, unexpected as it was. It was a delight to have you. So thank you for jumping on with us. And then of course, we lost Jumaane Williams, public advocate. He did want us to say a goodbye to everyone. So thank you to Jumaane Williams in absentia. And then of course to Brian Purnell, the author of Fighting Jim Crow in the County of Kings, the Congress of Racial Equality in Brooklyn, among other things. And to Jeanne Theoharis, A More Beautiful and Terrible History, the Uses and Misuses of Civil Rights History. I just love the name of that book. I love saying it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. I do want to mention that this was the second of 3 programs presented by the Center for Brooklyn History and New York University's Brooklyn-based 370J project in partnership with NYU's Office of Global Inclusion, Diversity, and Strategic Innovation, the Center for Black Visual Culture, and the Institute for Public Knowledge. For the next act, for our events page, just go there at brooklynlibrary.org. And please join us for the last in the series. Thanks to you all for being with us.
That was great.
Totally.
Thank you, Jami. Thank you, Jeanne. Jeanne, great to see you.
Good to see you too. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.